What's up everyone, welcome back to my Commander channel, and today we're going over a guide to removal in EDH, talking about all the removal spells for all 5 colors. So it's going to be fun, going to be informative. We're going to first go over why play removal, because you don't want to die. That's why you play removal. You're going to want to kill the threats that are going to kill you, and that could be they're attacking you. That could be threats that have a activated ability that's going to combo off anything really that you don't want on the battlefield that's going to end up winning the game for your opponent. You can just get rid of with a removal spell. You could also use it to kill hate bears or stacks creatures that keep you from playing. So if an opponent has a collector oof out and you're playing an artifact deck, that's when you need removal. If an opponent's playing something like a Tocatl Honor Guard, that's the one that stops ETB abilities, and you're playing ETB deck, you need to find a way to kill that. So your opponent's going to play creatures and stacks pieces, especially hate bears. You know, Thalia, you're playing a storm deck, it's going to be hard to beat a Thalia unless you remove the Thalia. So you want to kill those hate bears, your stacks creatures, and also you want to get in for attacks and kill the blockers. So these are some reasons why you want to play removal. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, why not just play a sweeper? Sweepers get rid of all of the creatures. And sweepers are good in some decks. If you're a controlling deck or a deck that doesn't care about its own creatures, sweepers are pretty good. However, sweepers kill your own creatures, so they don't get you ahead on board and are often pretty expensive, you know. Wrath of God is 4 mana, while most of these removal spells are 1 or 2 mana. Removal spells allow you to keep a board while getting rid of troubling permanents. So we're going to talk about white removal first. White removal. White is one of the best colors at removal in the game. Most of its removal is in the form of exile effects, which reduces the amount of our opponent's graveyard shenanigans. This is important because there are a lot of decks and a lot of strategies that recur creatures from the graveyard or who care about creatures in the graveyard. Well, white removal is basically, most of it is exile, so that way they cannot return those creatures or they can't count those for certain abilities. So the best white removal spell is Solitude. For the main fact that it's a creature and you can cast it for free. It has Evoke, exile a white card from your hand. If you exile a white card from your hand, you can cast this for free. And it does get sacrificed, but you still get the ability to exile a creature for free if you need to. It's good with effects that double your ETBs. You know, you play this with a Panharmonicon, you play this in the Elish Norn deck, it's really insane. But it's also really good with effects that flicker. You play your Solitude, exile a creature, someone else plays another creature. You can ephemerate the Solitude, get rid of another creature, so it gets rid of multiple creatures. And unlike things like Palace Jailer or Fiend Hunter, those creatures don't come back. It just exiles them forever. So I think this is the best removal spell because it can be cast for free. It's good with effects that double your ETBs or effects that flicker. It can also be tutored by creature tutors like Recruiter of the Guard or Wordly Tutor or Eladamri's Call, and triggers anything that cares about creatures like Guardian Project, or, you know, if you're really feeling spicy, you can play Up the Beanstalk, Solitude your opponent's creature, and draw a card from that. This is why I think it's S tier. Solitude is one of the best removal spells for Commander, just because of the fact that you can cast it for free, and because it's a creature, you can really abuse the Enter the Battlefield ability. Now, it does get stopped by things like Torpor Orb, or Tocatl Honor Guard, or Hushbringer. So it's not the best in every situation, but it's a very good card. The other S tier white removal spells are Path to Exile and Swords of Plowshares. 1 white mana, exile target creature. S tier, these are no questions asked removal for only 1 mana. And it also exiles the creatures. So you 1 mana, you just exile whatever the strongest creature is on the board. Whatever you need to get rid of, you just exile it. It's gone. No questions asked. And exile, of course, they can't recur it. The downsides are usually not relevant. The downside to Swords of Plowshares is not relevant because in most games, someone is winning by a lot. So, you know, Swords of Plowshares gaining someone 3 or 4 life is not going to matter in the long run. Some games it does matter, actually, but in a lot of games it doesn't. Now, Path to Exile, its downside actually does matter because its controller searches for a basic land card, so you are ramping your opponent. However, in a lot of situations, you would rather have your opponent ramp than have them have a combo piece or a big creature or a stacks piece on the board. These are an S tier because they're 1 mana. And they can exile anything. They're not as abusable as Solitude. You can't flicker these. You can't, draw cards from these entering, but they're just really cheap and really efficient. Next, we have Enchantment Removal. I put this in B tier. The reason I'm talking about this is because they trigger enchantresses. So if you're playing like a Sithis deck, or if you're playing any other enchantress commanders, these will draw you cards and exile creatures. And they work with enchantment synergy. So like if you have an enchantress out, or if you have a Serra Sanctum out, these will count for that. And they can be flickered if a new threat enters. So something like On Thin Ice. And when it enters, you exile target creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. This is actually a very good card for 1 white mana to exile something. It can be destroyed. That's its downside. It is an enchantment that can be interacted with. And it requires a snowland, but it's very strong. But if you exile a creature, and let's say a more problematic creature enters the battlefield, you can flicker your On Thin Ice to get the new creature. That's something you can do with these. I don't know how good it is, but it's another wrinkle for these cards. But these cards are very strong in Enchantress decks. And I think there are some decks that are mono-white removal decks that would play On Thin Ice or Grasp of Fate. Grasp of Fate's actually pretty strong, specifically in Commander. When it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls until it leaves the battlefield. So, obviously, if this is destroyed, they all return, and that's not the best. But if this stays on the battlefield, you get to exile up to 3 permanents with 1 card, which is pretty insane. So this card's insane in Commander. The only weaknesses to these is that their sorcery speed and they can be destroyed. That's why they're in B tier, but there are upsides if you're playing an Enchantress deck. Next, we have Broad Removal. These are an A tier. These can answer any type of permanent for usually less than that permanent costs. They're more expensive than Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares, but they're more versatile. And, you are playing a singleton format. So you put your Solitude, you put your Swords, you put your Path in there. You're going to need more than that, so you're going to put your Stroke of Midnight. You're going to put those generous gifts in there as well. Stroke of Midnight is probably the best one. 3 mana, destroy target non-land permanent. Now, Stroke of Midnight and Generous Gift, they do destroy, they do not exile, so that is relevant. But Stroke of Midnight, destroy target non-land permanent, and they make a 1/1 human, so who cares? Generous Gift is a little bit worse because it gives them a 3/3 elephant. However, I would rather my opponent have a 3/3 elephant than a stacks piece or a game-winning creature, right? Soul Partition is another one. You get to exile target non-land permanent for 2 mana, and for as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may play it, but they have to pay 2 more to cast it. So basically, this is an interesting card because it exiles the permanent, right? Now your opponent can cast it again, but it's going to cost 2 more mana. So it is removal. And this does see a lot of play, actually, Soul Partition in cEDH, because the games are a lot faster. And if you exile a non-land permanent, that's a stacks piece, or that's your opponent's combo piece, there's a good chance they might not be able to get that extra 2 mana to cast it. Now, in casual games of Commander, I think this is less good because games go longer, but it's still a relevant card. There are combos of this. If you play Soul Partition, you can exile something, and if you have Drannith Magistrate out, your opponent will never be able to cast it from exile. There are other things that are like that too. So I think Soul Partition has a use. They can cast it again from exile, but in a lot of faster, more competitive games, that downside doesn't really matter. And if you're in a proactive deck, that downside also doesn't matter. So Stroke of Midnight, Generous Gift, Soul Partition, I think all these are A tier. They are 3 mana. So that's a little bit more expensive than Path and Swords and On Thin Ice and Solitude, but I still think 3 mana it's not bad to pay. These aren't your first pick for your removal spells, but they're still pretty damn good. Alright. We also have mutation effects. So these are pretty good because they can turn a commander completely useless. So they're very good if an opponent relies on your commander. However, these are enchantments. They can be destroyed. But one positive thing about these is they're one of the few ways to turn a commander off. So if you exile a commander, your opponent puts it in their command zone, then can recast it. However, if you cast Reprobation on it, Make it lose all abilities and turn to a 0/1, or Darksteel mutation. Turn it into a 0/1 and make it lose all of its abilities. What these do is they trap it on the battlefield. Because it's not changing zones, your opponent can't put the commander back in the command zone. The only way that they can get their commander back is if they destroy this enchantment, or if they are able to sacrifice what you put the enchantment on. So these are good ways to trap the commander on the battlefield while also making them lose all of their abilities. It can turn off any creature as well. I think these vary between A and B tier depending on, obviously, if you use some commanders, they don't really care because they have strong ETBs, or they have they don't rely on their abilities. But if you play this on a commander that relies on its ability and trap it on the battlefield, that's going to be very strong. So it just depends on the situation. That's why I say this varies between A and B tier. Next, we're talking about blue removal. So blue is not so good at actually destroying creatures. It bounces creatures, or it can turn creatures into useless creatures. However, its destroy effects come with significant downside. We can see this on the Pongify effect. So Rapid Hybridization and Pongify are basically the same card. Destroy target creature, it can't be regenerated. 1-mana destroy target creature is pretty damn good. But its creature's controller creates a 3/3 green frog lizard or a 3/3 green ape. So it cheaply destroys any creature, but the downside is relevant if you don't have a board presence, and a 3/3 creature is actually like a legitimately sized threat in a lot of situations. Resculpt is more versatile because it can exile an artifact or a creature. It also exiles instead of destroys, so that's relevant. However, its controller creates a 4/4, and a 4/4 is pretty dangerous. But you got to think, using this rapid or this Pongify on a mana dork or a stacks creature, maybe not worth it because they'll get a 3/3 or a 4/4. But using this on using a Resculpt on a Bolas the Citadel or a Wormcoil Engine, definitely worth it, right? Or Resculpt on a Heliod, definitely worth it, especially if your opponent's going to kill the game. So you got to think about, okay, are these going to be worth it in these situations? These are A tier because they can cheaply destroy any creature. However, there is a serious downside. These are pretty good in Commander. They're less good in 60-card formats because the downside is actually relevant. But when you have 40 life and 3 opponents, the downside isn't as big, but it can still possibly be big. Reality Shift is similar, but only hits creatures and has a possibility of giving the opponent a card. I think Rapid Hybridization and Pongify and Resculpt are better than Reality Shift. Next, we have cards that make your opponent's threat stay on board as a non-threat. So these are similar to Reprobation and Darksteel Mutation. They lock down commanders like Darksteel Mutation and turn any threats off. However, they can be destroyed, and it's not permanent removal. But the strength of these is if you witness protection an opponent's commander, they're going to have to go through a lot of steps. They're going to have to either get rid of your enchantment or sacrifice the creature or have it die somehow to be able to put their commander back in the command zone or have their commander against. These are good ways to turn a commander off. And Imprisoned in the Moon is actually really good because it turns into a land, so it can't be destroyed by Rafts. The only way they can really get their commander back is if you Imprison the Moon, is if they get rid of the enchantment, which some decks can't do. So these are a good way of turning off an opponent's commander, which I think is a really good thing in the format. In 60 cards formats, these aren't as good, but in Commander, where the commander is relevant and there's a lot of ways players can get commander backs, getting their a lot of people have a lot of ways of getting their commander back in Commander, and having cards that prevent your opponent from doing that are pretty strong. And I really like Imprison in the Moon because it turns into a land, so it stays after a Wrath. It's still locked down after a Wrath or after a sacrifice back. They actually have to destroy the enchantment to get their commander back. So these are pretty strong. Imprison in the Moon on a opponent's Krenko, that Krenko's never going to do anything for the rest of the game. Black removal. So black is the best color at destroying creatures. It's not the best removal color, but it's the best color at destroying creatures. It can destroy creatures for free, and the only downside is that some of the best spells have the non-black clause, but it has recently gotten better at exiling creatures, I've noticed by looking at these cards. So it's the best destroy color, not the best removal color, but it has some free removal spells, which is pretty strong. However, you gotta be careful because some of his best spells have the non-black clause, like Snuff Out. Snuff Out is an insane card. Snuff Out is probably one of the best Magic cards ever printed, and I'm not joking. If you control a swamp, you may pay 4 life rather than pay its mana cost and destroy target non-black creature. It can't be regenerated. The issue is that it's a non-black creature. So if your opponent has a black deck or has a black creature, then Snuff Out can't kill it. But if your opponent doesn't play black, Snuff Out might be one of the best cards in your deck. Deadly Rollick is similar to Snuff Out in that you can cast it for free. However, it requires you to have your commander out, so it's not as good as Snuff Out. Having a swamp is a lot easier than having your commander out. However, Deadly Rollick can exile any creature, so its upside is slightly better. However, I think Snuff Out's the better card between these two. However, they're both S tier. They're free. Free is the best cost. Plus, there's no need to pitch any cards. Solitude, you have to pitch a card. But these, you don't have to pitch a card. These might be the best removal spells in the game if Solitude wasn't a creature, right? If like Solitude being a creature, you can abuse it with flickering effects and stuff. But these are insanely good. I really like these. And if you're playing black, you should definitely be playing at least Snuff Out. Deadly Rollick does require you to have your commander and is very expensive. Snuff Out's only like, what, $6? Should definitely be playing Snuff Out. Next, we have 1 mana removal. Dismember, I think, is one of the most underlooked cards in Commander because people see -5/-5 and think that it doesn't kill a lot, but it actually kills a lot. Most creatures are not going to have 5 power or toughness, and what you can do is if a creature has 7 power, right? You can block it with like a 2/3 and then give your opponent's creature -5/-5 and still kill it. It is 1 mana and 4 life, so it's very similar to Snuff Out in that you're paying life. Now, what's an upside of Dismember is that it can kill indestructible threats because it gives it -5/-5. It's not a destroy effect. So there are 2 cards in particular that I think this works really well against. Well, if your opponent has a Mithril Coat or a Darksteel Plate on their commander and you just dismember it, they're going to feel really bad about that, and that's going to be hilarious. But Heliod Suncrowned and Perforos, God of the Forge, are both indestructible creatures that are parts of combos or that are just really good in general. Dismember will kill both of them for 1 mana. It's just a really good way. A lot of creatures will die to Dismember, and it kills indestructible creatures like Heliod and Perforos. It's pretty good. And, you know, like I said, your opponent puts a Darksteel Plate on their commander, they attack with it. If it doesn't have 5 toughness, you can kill it with Dismember, and your opponent will be very sad. Defile is another strong one. I said it's B tier because it's inconsistent. If you only have 2 or 3 swamps out, it's not that great. But in late game where you have like 8 or 9 swamps out, if you have an Urborg and you have even more swamps out, Defile can just eradicate everything. Defile is B tier because it's really inconsistent. It's really good in the late game. It's not so good in the early game, but Defile has the strengths of Dismember in that it gets around indestructible creatures by giving them -1/-1 for each swamp you control, and it's also 1 mana. I like Defile if you're playing like a mono black deck. If you're not playing mono black, Defile becomes less good. But if you're playing straight up mono black, Defile is going to be high up on your removal tier list. Next, we have the Doomblades. Doomblade's not a good card. These are good Doomblades. These are Doomblades, but good. Both are A tier, and both can get rid of any creature for 2 mana. The downsides aren't very large in most games. So Infernal Grasp, 2 mana, destroy target creature, you lose 2 life. Okay, I don't care about losing 2 life because that creature was going to cause me to lose more than that anyways, right? So Infernal Grasping, definitely a positive result. Baleful Mastery, you may pay 1 in a black rather than pay that spell's mana cost, and an opponent gets to draw a card. You get to exile target creature or planeswalker. By the way, 2 mana to exile target creature is already good, but you can also hit a planeswalker with this, which is very versatile and strong. And I know what you say, oh, but you give your opponent a card. You don't have to give the opponent that you destroyed their permanent the card. You can give a different opponent the card. It's just an opponent. So you have player A, B, and C. You kill player A's planeswalker. You can give player C a card. and if player C happens to be your ally, then that's just a really positive exchange. Yeah, Baleful Mastery is actually a very strong card. It should see more play in 60 card formats because of how versatile it is. And the fact is that Baleful Mastery exiles. So you can just exile any creature or planeswalker with this. That's pretty darn strong. And it's only for 2 mana. Infernal Grasp is also very strong, 2. But in a Commander game, I think Baleful Mastery is probably a slightly higher pick than Infernal Grasp. But both of these I still say great in Commander. Next we have Feed the Swarm. So this is a weird one because it's a sorcery and you have to lose life equal to the permanent's mana value. But it's like the only black card that can destroy enchantments. Like, black and red have always had an issue destroying enchantments. But, you know, Feed the Swarm can just destroy enchantments for 2 mana. That's pretty insane, especially if you're playing mono black or red black and you have really no other way to destroy enchantments. Feed the Swarm is just very good. So its life loss downside isn't a huge deal in Commander, honestly. And the downside of it being a sorcery is actually pretty big, but I think it's offset by its positive ability to kill enchantments. So Feed the Swarm should probably be in your Commander decks. Very strong card. Next, we're going to talk about the Trigger Sacrifice. I put these on here because I like these cards. I play a Teysa deck that these cards are pretty strong in. These vary between B tier and C tier. So what it does is they enter the battlefield and they cause each player to sacrifice a creature. So they're very good if you have effects that want you to sacrifice creatures, like a Grim Horror Spec that draws you cards, or a Blood Artist, right? And these are very good if you can recur them from the graveyard or if you can flicker them. They're very good then. These are pretty good in the specific decks, but generally you have to have a specific deck in mind to play these in, that like an Aristocrats deck or something. These are great. Playing a Linda or you're playing Teysa, these are insane. But if you're playing Tiny Bones, actually Tiny Bones, these might be decent in Tiny Bones too. But especially Playcrafter. But if you're playing Keurig, right? And you probably wouldn't play it there. So it just depends on your deck, but these can be pretty darn strong. I forgot to put Shieldred's Edict on this list. I think Shieldred's Edict is B tier. Your opponent gets to choose what they sacrifice, but you get 3 players sacrificing. So that's good. I think Shieldred's Edict is on B tier. I forgot to put it on the slides. Just reminded me of them. Now we're going to talk about Red Removal. They're very good for destroying small creatures like Mana Dorks or Hate Bears. For larger creatures, you either need to pay lots of mana or use a Chaos Warp effect, which has their downsides. First of all, we're going to talk about Fury. Its strength depends on how competitive the meta is. In a very casual meta, if you're playing casual EDH, you've probably never seen this card. However, in cEDH, this card's insane. And in Modern, this card's insane. In Legacy, this card's insane. So it's free like Solitude. However, when it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and/or planeswalkers. So, in a cEDH meta, this can wipe out multiple Mana Dorks, multiple Stacks creatures, or someone's commander for free. So if your opponent's playing an aggro deck, your opponent's playing Mana Dorks or Stacks creatures like Thalia or Archon of Emeria, let's say your opponent has a Thalia and they have a Soul Warden out, and another player has a Delighted Halfling. This can kill all 3 of them for free. It's insane. And also, one really good thing about this card is it's very good if you flicker it. But also, it's a decent threat. A 3/3 double strike can close games pretty quickly and can block lots of things. In a cEDH meta, this card's very strong because it can be pitch cast and it can wipe out multiple creatures. In casual, I think that you're going to have some synergies for this to work, like if you have elemental synergies or if you have lots of flickering. But I still think it can be strong in a casual meta. If you play Modern, though, you know how backbreaking this card can be if you're playing Mana Dorks or White Hate Bears or really any creature deck. This card's insane against. Next, we have Chaos Warp. So I put these at B tier. They can destroy any type of permanent if you're playing a red deck, which red has issues with. The downside is it can give your opponent a potentially better card. Chaos Warp can just whiff, so your opponent might not get something off Chaos Warp, but Wild Magic Surge always gives a permanent, which is a pretty big downside, but there's a chance that that permanent's going to be less good. If you Wild Magic Surge their best creature, they can flip over a Mana Dork, right? Or their best enchantment, they can flip over a bad enchantment. So it's going to be fine most of the time, but there is some downside there. Wild Magic Surge does destroy the permanent, and then they reveal cards until they reveal a permanent card that shares a card type. They put the card on the battlefield and rest on the bottom. So if they only have one enchantment in their deck and you Wild Magic Surge it, I guess they don't get another enchantment. I didn't really think about that. But, obviously if you Wild Magic Surge a big creature, they could potentially get another big creature into play. However, if there's specific cards that you want off the battlefield, like Smothering Tide or Rhystic Study, or a Stacks piece, Wild Magic Surge, and Chaos Warp are very good at getting those things off the battlefield. Your opponent might get another permanent, but it's probably not going to be as good. Chaos Warp does shuffle it into your opponent's library, so it gets around indestructible. It's one thing to notice there. Well, Wild Magic Surge doesn't. Lastly, we have burn spells. I don't know how to rate these in Commander, because, Lightning Bolt is a great card in Modern, but in Commander it doesn't really seem all that good. However, it still has utility. It can kill the small creatures such as Mana Dorks or your Hate Bears. And, this is good in a meta with lots of Mana Dorks and Hate Bears. It does get worse late game, though. So something like Lightning Bolt might not be that great. I think Flame Slash is actually pretty decent in Commander because it's 1 red mana, deal 4, and that has a lot more utility than 1 red mana, deal 3. However, the best burn spell in Commander is a Braid. It can kill a Mana Dork, it can kill a Hate Bear, but it can also just destroy an artifact. Very strong card, versatile card, sees play in almost all red decks in cEDH and in Casual. Next, we're going to go to green removal. So it's the weakest removal color for creatures. It's very good at destroying enchantments and artifacts, but not good at creatures. Its best removal are enchantments that turn creatures useless. The bite effects are playable if you have a large creature. And the Beast Within is versatile, but it's overcosted and has a downside. So these are the best green cards. You've seen cards like this. Song of the Dryads is very similar to Imprison in the Moon. It's actually basically the same card. It can turn any permanent off, even a commander. And Song of the Dryads has the upside that if it turns it into a land, so, your opponent rafts the board, they don't remove it, and they can't get it back even in a raft. So you can turn off a Planeswalker, or it can turn off a commander for as long as your opponent doesn't remove this enchantment. So that's pretty good. Kindred's Transformation is a good one because it draws a card when it comes in. And these allow the green decks to answer any type of permanent. They're also enchantments, so if you're playing a Sithis deck, these are very good because they'll draw you cards and turn off your opponent's stuff. I like these cards because they turn off commanders. And Kindred's Transformation, it only hits creatures, though. That's the downside of this card, but it does draw you a card. Alright, next, Beast Within. I think it's the best removal in green. It destroys any type of permanent. However, it's a bit overcosted at 3 mana, and giving your opponent a 3/3 can be a real downside. This is seen play in a lot of green decks in 60-card formats and in Commander because it's very versatile, and green doesn't really have many better options. The white version of this Generous Gift doesn't see as much play because white has better options. But in a green deck, I think this is very good, and it destroys any permanent. And that's pretty good. The only thing is that green doesn't really have any problem destroying enchantments or artifacts. So this is really here because of creature removal, basically. But it does a decent job at that. And of course, if you're playing big creatures, giving your opponent a 3/3 doesn't matter. Next, we're going to talk about bite effects. So these are going to be good if you have a large creature in play, and they are Infectious Bite, Tail Swipe, and Ram Through. These are the ones I selected. There's more. These are the best ones. Infectious Bite. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. And it gives each opponent a poison counter. So if you're playing a poison and proliferate deck, you could actually win with an Infectious Bite, which is hilarious. But one thing about Infectious Bite and Ram Through is that opponent's creature does not deal damage to your creature. You just deal damage to that creature. So if you have a large creature, this can be actually pretty decent removal. They each have an upside. Now, Ram Through, if your creature has trample, the excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller. So if you have just a huge trampling creature, you can ram through an opponent's creature and deal tons of damage to them, which is pretty sweet. Tail Swipe is 1 mana, so that's why it's on here. Choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. If you cast a spell during your main phase, the creature you control gets +1/+1, and they fight, so it does deal damage to your creature. And so it's not as good as something like Infectious Bite or Ram Through, but it's only 1 mana. And if you have a large creature, these are actually very effective ways of getting rid of problem creatures, right? Green has a problem with destroying other creatures, so these are ways that we can do that. Next, we're talking about multicolored. Multicolored cards, especially those with black, are very efficient at destroying creatures. Black, green, and black, white, I think, are the best combos for removal. But I don't know if they're better than the one color removal spells out there. I think that if you're playing a black green deck, I'd rather play Snuff Out than Putrefy, right? But there are some good options here. Assassin's Trophy is very similar to Beast Within, but just much better. So Beast Within is 3 mana. This is only 2 mana. This is very versatile and an inexpensive way to remove any type of permanent, just like a Beast Within. However, it does ramp your opponent, but ramp isn't as much of a upside or much of a downside as giving your opponent a 3/3 sometimes. And then also, sometimes your opponent doesn't have a basic land in their deck, right? But this is very good. It's very versatile, and it's an inexpensive way to remove any type of permanent. Any black-green deck should be running this. This is A tier. Next, we're talking about Orzhov removal. There's a lot of options for Orzhov. Anguished Unmaking is a 3 mana, lets you exile target non-land permanent. You do lose 3 life, but who cares? That permanent was either going to stop you from winning or deal you more than 3 damage. So you might as well Anguished Unmaking it to get rid of it. So this is interesting because white really doesn't have many ways to exile. I mean, it has ways to exile creatures, but as far as just exiling any permanent, it doesn't really have that many ways. So when white and black are together, I guess, they get to exile any non-land permanent. So Anguished Unmaking, very strong here. Vanishing Verse, white and black, exile target monocolored permanent. So there's a restriction, but most permanents you're going to worry about are monocolored. Aside from commanders, but most of the stuff you care about, not Primeval Titan, but it's banned, but things like Smothering Tide or Rhystic Study, or just large creatures, Vorinclex, Perforos, Heliod, this is going to be able to exile those permanents. And now most commanders it will not be able to exile, but I think it's still a pretty good card. Despark is one of my favorite cards. It can exile target permanent of mana value 4 or greater. Now, some commanders don't get exiled by this, but most commanders do. And then most problematic permanents like Smothering Tide do. But there are some permanents that don't get exiled by this, like Rhystic Study, for instance. But Despark is a pretty good option. And if you're playing a white-black deck, these are good options in there. Although, you probably play Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile and Snuff Out. Which ones of these do you play? It depends on what type of meta you are. If your opponent's playing a lot of monocolored decks, you're going to play Vanishing Verse. If they're playing a lot of large commanders, you're going to be playing Despark. I think Anguished Unmaking does go in every Orzhov deck, though. There's also Utter End, but Utter End is 4 mana, and 4 mana is a whole lot. But it still works if you're playing in a more casual pod. We have some more multicolor removal. These are various. These are varied in how good they are. Chained to the Rocks. It's a Boros card. You enchant mountain you control, and then it enters the battlefield to exile target creature an opponent controls until it leaves. So if you're playing like a Naya Enchantress deck, this is pretty good. But, white, I think, has better options at removing creatures. This is good if you need that, 4th or 5th Path to Exile effect. You have Path, you have Swords, you have On Thin Ice. If you just need that Chain to the Rocks, and if you need something more than what you have, Terminate's actually a very good card. Or 2 mana, you destroy target creature, it can't be regenerated. It reminds me of Infernal Grasp. It's probably on the same level as that. I don't think it's as good as Baleful Mastery or Snuff Out, but I think in a black-red deck, you should definitely be playing Terminate. And then Drown in the Lock is a versatile card because you can either counter spell or destroy a creature. However, it's dependent on how many cards your opponent has in their graveyard. So if you're playing a Dimir Mill deck, this card's going to be like the best card in your deck. But if you're just playing like a normal Grixis deck or a normal Dimir deck, this card's not going to be very good. So it's very contingent on which type of strategy you're playing. Like my Dimir Fairies deck that's not doing any mill, I'm not going to have Drown in the Lock. But in a Dimir Mill deck, I will definitely have Drown in the Lock. As we're talking about colorless removal, it's very bad. It's over-accosted or requires you to meet tough preconditions. The sweepers in colorless are actually quite good. You have things like O-Stone, All Is Dust. I brought up All Is Dust because, in a weird way, it's kind of more removal than sweeper. So each player sacrifices all permanents they control that are one or more colors, right? But if you're playing a colorless deck, it's not going to hit anything you have. It's just going to sweep the board of all your opponent's stuff. So All His Dust is going to be very good as far as colorless removal. But we have some other ones I want to talk about. I didn't rate these in the tier because they're all just bad. But if you're playing like a Kozilek or a Ulamog deck, you don't really have many better options. Introduction to Annihilation is a 5 mana exile target non-land permanent. Its controller draws a card, and it's a sorcery speed. This card's very bad. But it's one of your best options at colorless as far as spot removal. But I don't think you need to play it. You probably shouldn't play it. It's probably not worth it. Desecrate Reality is actually good, though. In a colorless deck, in a slower pod, for each opponent, exile up to 1 target permanent that player controls with an even mana value. Sometimes some weird things will happen where you won't get permanents, but you'll get 3 permanents from this. But if at least 3 colorless mana was spent to cast a spell, you return a permanent card with an odd mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this is, you remove 3 permanents from your opponent, and you get to reanimate something from your graveyard. Very strong card in a dedicated colorless deck. I like this a lot. And then Titan's Presence is actually a pretty good removal spell for colorless. As additional cost to cast a spell, reveal a colorless creature card from your hand. So you reveal like a 7 mana or an 8 mana Eldrazi from your hand. Because you play colorless decks, you're probably going to have that. And then you exile target creature if its power is less than or equal to that revealed card's power. If you reveal an Ulamog, you're going to be able to exile that creature. It's very contingent on what you have in your hand, but it's mostly pretty good and your best option in colorless. So we went over all of the colors, some multicolored options, and colorless options for removal. Anyways, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you is a helpful guide to removal spells, and I hope you liked it. I have also one to counter spells too, if you want to check that out. Anyways, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye bye.